Today on the Word Preacher Podcast, getting through the chick flick of the scriptures. I'm Brett Jensen, and this is the Word Preacher Podcast. All right, our Come Follow Me curriculum for this coming week will take us to the book of Ruth and also the intro for Samuel, the birth of Samuel to Hannah. We're not going to talk a lot about that. Instead, let's talk about chick flicks. Now, when I was younger, I took a philosophy course at a community college in Southern California. And the instructor came in with very unusual hair color and style and a plethora of piercings. Did not look like a professor of anything. And something that this professor was very passionate about, feminist ethics. It was something I hadn't even considered. And she said the problem with how men reasoned was that they looked for universal general principles, but there's always conditions where those don't hold up, and that women emphasize empathy and care. It's the ethics of care. Essentially, it just became clear as the course went on that this was just moral relativism with some new terminology duct taped to the side. As little value as the course provided me, though, it did highlight that regardless of family relationships, geographic location, socioeconomic status, or any other factors, women are, in fact, different than men. That was absolutely true, and that's something everybody related to. One of the critical differences between men and women can be found in entertainment that targets one or the other of those groups. There's a reason that the term chick flick exists. Now, for example, I know a lot of women who really enjoy witty period piece social dramas, such as Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. As a man, this story was always painfully dull. I mean, sure, there were characters who did unreputable or dishonorable things, but the primary negative consequence to the whole situation with Elizabeth Bennet was trying to avoid having people think less of her. That was it. She had stuff she wanted to do but couldn't because if she did, people would think less of her. Now, the drama in the story comes from untangling the connections that people are trying to establish between individuals. And it finds its resolution when Elizabeth realizes that she had prejudged the character Mr. Darcy, who, in spite of some prideful missteps, was actually an honorable man. Navigating the social maze that prevented the protagonist from achieving their ideal connections provides many women with great entertainment. They love it. And there's nothing wrong with loving that. But for men, the social maze that they're in, that these characters find themselves in, is something that feels like it's sort of their own making. They could ignore that social maze and just get to the point. Get to what they actually want. Achieve their true goals. A bit of honesty might have saved hours of beating around the bush. And they were never really in any danger. I mean, except maybe in the off-the-wall remake, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. And they never really accomplished anything significant outside of establishing new social connections. Now, contrast this story with one of my favorites, The Lord of the Rings. Now, I know you might be thinking, hey, I know plenty of girls who like Lord of the Rings. Women can enjoy Lord of the Rings too. And that's true, but that's not really the point. It's also true that men can enjoy some aspects of Pride and Prejudice. But make no mistake, it was written by a woman, about women, for women. And Lord of the Rings was written by a man, about men, for men. Of course, there is romance in Lord of the Rings, notably between Aragorn Elessar and Arwen Undomiel. And the romance is an important part of the story, but it is not the story. Now, in the books, as opposed to in the movies, which were excellent, you should see them if you haven't, but in the books, Aragorn wanted to become king. And this was notably because Arwen's father, Lord Elrond of Rivendell, indicated that his daughter could only be married by a man who was great enough to be actually king of a united Gondor and Arnor, which was the fallen kingdom where the Rangers were, where Aragorn was. His efforts to achieve this goal were bold and courageous, even though mankind in general, at that point in the world that Tolkien created, had limited resources and waning power in both the nations of Rohan and Gondor. He forced Sauron to act before he was ready to launch his true invasion. He forced his hand, he drew him out, and in the end, most dramatically, pulled the attention of Lord Sauron at great personal risk, away from two little hobbits ascending the slopes of Orodruin, or Mount Doom. His friends were vital in the story. Legolas and Gimli and hobbits and the Fellowship, important, but it was really his courage that brought them together. His acts that helped preserve Theoden at Helm's Deep, that helped find where Merry and Pippin had gone, what he was able to bring to save Gondor in the Battle of Pelennor Fields at the end, his long journeys even before, in secret, tracking down what happened to Gollum, traveling huge distances to bring information to Gandalf the Grey, and to also help Frodo, the ring bearer, get safely to Rivendell, and then later, as a part of the Fellowship, beyond the forests of Galadriel. So, in public and in private, when he was leading large forces or on his own in the wild, he demonstrated consistent valor and goodness that overcame a threat that would have covered all of Middle-earth in great darkness. Huge stakes, end of the world, a Dark Lord taking over, and his courage prevented that. It's an incredible story. The connection between he and his friends was only important because it fueled their ability, the ability of each of them, to do important things. Now, I won't say that's the only reason that it's important. I'll qualify that, but it's the main reason that it was important. And you can contrast that to the connection between Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. That's an end in and of itself. Now, of course, Mr. Darcy did do good things on the side, helped make sure that the Bennets weren't in a scandal and exposed to people who were disreputable. There were several things that he did that were good and noble. And you can see that it is motivated by his true feelings about Elizabeth Bennet. So there is a similarity, but we can see that we can see that the real end of the story was the connection itself. Now, that doesn't mean there are no chick flicks that don't take place with something big taking place in the background. For example, my grandmother absolutely loved the movie Gone with the Wind, based off of Margaret Mitchell's novel. And it's set in the South around the time of the Civil War, right before and during and after the Civil War. There are great and important things that happened to the nation during this time period. But the story focuses on the connections of the character Scarlett O'Hara to those who were close to her, the men she loved, Ashley, the good friend of whom she was jealous, Melanie, the man she ended up with, Rhett Butler. I really disliked the story. I disliked the movie because it largely ignored the importance of the big events that were occurring in favor of these little connections between mostly dislikable characters. Incidentally, we took my grandmother to see one of the Lord of the Rings movies when it was in theaters. I think it was The Two Towers. And although I absolutely loved it, she did not. She disliked it. That was not her favorite thing. And I think that it kind of speaks to these roles that we have. Where is the emphasis? Is it on the big things in the background that are shaping the world and shaping society? Or does it focus on the little connections between people? Men can appreciate connections, as we talked about with Aragorn being with Arwen. That connection was very important. His loyalty to his friends, Sam and Frodo, very important to him. But it was different in terms of how it was emphasized than the relationships versus the big picture that occurred in either of the other examples, the chick flick examples. And understanding that difference is critical to getting something out of the book of Ruth. I know there was a long discussion about entertainment before we finally get to the scriptures. Ruth is the chick flick of the scriptures. The book of Ruth is a chick flick. The idea behind it, Ruth she's from the nation of Moab, and she lives with her Israelite husband and their family. The men die. The men of their house die in the land of Moab, where she had lived her life. And Naomi, her mother-in-law, is worried about how the surviving women, her daughters-in-law, are going to endure without the help of men. And she encourages them to find other men and go back to their homes and their country so that they can survive. But Ruth refuses to leave Naomi, bringing us to the famous verses in the book. This is Ruth chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. And Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God. Where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me." Based on this connection that Ruth had to Naomi, she travels to Bethlehem, falls in love with the man of that town named Boaz, and they navigate the social maze that is appropriate for their time period or applicable for their time period. And ultimately, they are able to be together. Now, as a man, this story is mostly important just because of the last few verses of the book. That is, of their union was born Obed, who was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David, who established the royal line of the kings of Judah that ultimately led down to the birth of the Lord Jesus Christ. And seeing how the roots of that line were established is significant in a big picture kind of way. But many people look at this famous verse and they say, oh, Ruth was so brave to leave her home and her family, her faith. And there may be some truth to that. But I want to emphasize the true hero of this story is not Ruth. It's Naomi. Naomi's connections made an impact. Her love of God was carried through her connections to her daughter-in-law. And because of the love and care that they shared, Ruth came a part of the nation of Israel. The story would not even have been recorded had it been the other way around, where Naomi says, I'll follow you, Ruth. I'll go with you. And I'll put away the Lord in favor of serving whatever you've got in Moab. I need to be with you. Even though the connection would be the same, had it gone the other direction, it would not have been a valuable story. And I think that's important to understand. The moral strength of women it flows from connections with other people. These connections define women's strength. And it's also important because of this other direction, because it implies that moral weakness can flow from the same connections. I'd like to provide a real-life example. There's an actual lovely girl who identifies as an Exmo and does a YouTube channel in which she, quote-unquote, shares how the culture of the church harmed her. Essentially, she's defining, all the problems in my life came from being a part of the Church of Jesus Christ. And they don't like these people, and they lied about this, and, one of these anti-sort of channels. Well, her connections with culture were very important to the story that she tells. Because she used to be a part of the church, she has these connections. She therefore portrays herself as an authority on the church because of these emotional connections that she had with individuals in the church. And recently, she came out on her channel and declared that even after years of being in a straight relationship with her husband, she discovered through new connections that she has explored, now that she's no longer being, bound in connections with the church, that she has discovered she is also attracted to women. She's come out as bi. And I just find it ironic that she could identify the impact of religious connections on her life, but not that her new progressive connections might also impact her life. In order to maintain strength, women have to be very careful about the connections they create and nurture. This is absolutely a theme in the story like Pride and Prejudice, in which some people who may seem to be good at first may not be, and connections forged with them may be detrimental. And at some point, you may discover that somebody who seemed arrogant and selfish may not be. And establishing the right connections brings actual happiness. Naomi's connection to God first was what brought Ruth to Israel. For both men and women, if there is something or someone that is more important than God, shift your focus. Connect first with God and let this connection fuel and define and shape all of your other connections. There's a reason that Jesus called this the first and great commandment, to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy mind and with all thy strength. Consider how a careless connection with ungodly Jezebel brought death and terror to Israel, and though we'll talk about it later when we cover Kings and Chronicles, also to Judah. Jezebel is like the anti-Naomi, who formed strong connections with people, but not for their betterment. Find people, search them out. Find people like Naomi, who put God and goodness first, and distance yourself from people like Jezebel. Now, this may seem a little counterintuitive because we're supposed to love everyone and not be eagerly judgmental, but in the end, it may be necessary to distance yourself from individuals who are abusive or who encourage you to disregard or compromise your covenants with God, with spouse, and children. If you check in your local priesthood quorum and relief society, odds are you'll be able to find connections that will help you to better yourself and your family by putting God first. In the end, God wants to connect with you, and to have his connection with you define your path. He can provide real moral strength. He hears and answers prayers. And the end of his path, no matter how long or hard it may seem at times, will result in eternal happiness. Whether you're a man or a woman, search for the way in which the scriptures will connect with you and help you become who you are meant to be. We appreciate all the support for the Word Preacher podcast. Next week, we will look at 1 Samuel, looking at the rise and fall of the first king of Israel. Of course, there's a ton of stuff we did not cover in the reading this week. Please study that individually and with your family. And of course, as always, fight on.